Today I'm going to tell you a story so heartbreaking and so quietly devastating that it still echoes in the Red Rock Canyons long after the last word fades. It unfolds in the merciless heart of the Wild West, where sacred springs run clear and the mountain spirits never forgive. This is the place where two worlds collide, one bound by ancient law, the other fleeing chains of greed and violence. It begins with a single footprint. One small, desperate print left by a white woman's boot on ground that must never be touched. That one step awakened something older than memory and forced a man to choose between his people's survival and a stranger's life. The wind had died completely by the time the sun cleared the ridge. No whisper through the pinon, no rustle in the bunch grass. Only the scrape of Kael's moccasins on sandstone and the slow, deliberate beat of his own heart. He crouched beside the game trail arrow, nocked but not drawn, studying the single print pressed into the soft earth where no white foot should ever fall. The outline was small, hurried, the heel dug deep as though the runner had stumbled. A woman. Beyond the print lay the narrow tongue of ground the old ones called forbidden. Not because men had decided it, but because the mountain spirits, the gone, had claimed it long before any band walked these slopes. To cross was to invite the restless dead to follow. Kael's fingers tightened on the bowstring, then eased. He did not rise. He waited. The silence stretched until it pressed against his eardrums like wet clay. Then, faint as a dying coal, came the sound he had dreaded, a single twig snapping farther down the draw. Not the careful placement of an Apache foot. Panic, exhaustion. Someone running blind. He lifted his gaze. Through the sparse juniper, a figure flickered, pale dress torn at the hem, hair loose and dark with sweat arms pumping as though the very air resisted her. She broke from the trees onto the open ground, saw the sacred spring ahead, and veered toward it without hesitation. One step, two. Her boots struck the packed earth of the forbidden strip. Dust rose in a thin plume. Kael felt the change before he saw it. The air thickened. The small hairs along his forearms lifted. Somewhere high on the ridge, a hawk should have screamed. None did. The mountain held its breath. The woman, pale skin streaked with dirt and blood, dropped to her knees at the water's edge, cupped her hands, drank in great, gulping swallows. Each swallow was a violation. Each drop that fell from her chin darkened the sand. Kael's stomach turned not from disgust, but from recognition. The law was not written. It was remembered in the bones. Spill blood here, spill water here, leave a mark here, and the ghosts remember. They follow. They linger. They take payment in fever, in barren wombs, in children who never cry. He could still walk away. Turn his back, let the spirits deal with her as they would. The band would never know. His own fire would burn the same tomorrow. But the woman lifted her head. Her eyes, wide wild, the color of wet slate, found his across the narrow clearing. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she saw the bow in his hand, the arrow still nocked, and her breath caught in a small broken sound. Kael lowered the bow, slow, deliberate, until the arrow pointed at the ground. He took one step forward onto the forbidden earth. The instant his moccasin touched the silence, deepened into something heavier than before, something that carried weight and memory and warning. He felt it settle across his shoulders like a wet blanket. There would be no washing this away. Behind her, far down the draw, a distant shout rolled up the slope, men's voices, rough, impatient. Horses. They were close. The woman scrambled backward, slipping once, and the wet sand eyes locked on him. Fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition, not of him, but of the choice he had just made. Kael stopped 5 paces away. He spoke low, the words measured, accented, but clear. You are on ground that does not forgive. She swallowed, wiped her mouth with the back of a trembling hand. I had no choice. He studied her a long moment, the torn dress of the blood on her sleeve, the raw scrape across one cheek. Then he looked past her, toward the sound of pursuit growing louder. Neither, he said quietly, do I. He extended one hand palm up, not touching her, only offering distance enough for her to decide. The shouts drew nearer. A horse snorted. Metal clinked. The woman stared at his open hand, as though it were a loaded rifle. Then slowly she reached out. The water ran cold and clear over the stones, but the instant her knees hit the shallows, a thin thread of red curled away from the cut on her forearm. It spread slow across the surface, darkening the sand beneath. Kael stood motionless on the far bank bow, still low arrow forgotten against his thigh. The smell of wet earth and iron rose sharp between them. He had watched her fall. Not a graceful tumble exhaustion took her like a club. One moment she was running. The next her legs folded and she pitched forward, palms slapping the water. Now she knelt there, gasping, hair plastered dark to her neck, dress heavy and clinging. The blood kept coming steady, drip by drip, staining the sacred flow. Kael felt the mountain notice. No bird called. No breeze stirred the willow along the bank. The gone were listening, and they did not approve. Blood of an outsider here on ground where no grave should ever be dug, where no wound should ever weep, was invitation enough. Ghosts remembered such things. They followed the current downstream, carried fever into the winter camps, withered the corn before it tasseled. He had seen it once years ago when a Mexican trapper bled out near the old crossing. 3 children sickened that spring. None recovered. He could turn now, walk back the way he came. Let her bleed, let the spirits take what they would. The band would never know a white woman had touched this water. His own hands would stay clean. But the woman lifted her head again. Her eyes gray as storm slate met his without flinching this time. Fear was there raw and bright, yet she did not beg. She only watched him waiting for the arrow or the knife or whatever came next. Kael exhaled once slow. The breath tasted of pinon smoke and dust. He stepped into the stream. Water rose cold to his calves. Each footfall sent small ripples outward, carrying more of her blood downstream. The violation was complete now, his own moccasins marking the earth, his weight pressing the sand where hers had already pressed. No going back from this. The ghosts would know his name as well as hers. She shrank back, an inch water swirling around her knees. Her hand went instinctively to her side, searching for something that wasn't there, a knife, a pistol, anything. Nothing. Kael stopped 3 paces away, close enough to see the tremble in her shoulders, the pulse jumping at her throat. He lowered himself slowly to one knee in the water, keeping both hands visible, palms open. The current tugged at his leggings, cold as judgment. "You are bleeding on ground that remembers," he said, voice low, steady. "It will not forget." She swallowed. "I didn't know." "You know now." Her gaze dropped to the red thread curling between them, then back to his face. Something passed across her expression. Not surrender, not hope. Recognition. The same recognition he felt in his own chest, the moment when choice narrows to a single, painful line. From down the draw came the first sharp crack of a rifle. Not close yet, but closer. Horses blowing hard, men cursing the steep grade. Kael did not look away from her. He reached out slow, deliberate, until his hand hovered above the water between them, not touching, offering only the space for her to cross it. She stared at his open palm. Water dripped from her chin. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Another rifle shot echoed nearer this time. A horse screamed. Her fingers closed around his wrist, cold slick with blood and stream water. Not a grasp of trust, a grasp of necessity. Kael pulled her up. She swayed once, then steadied against him, weight slight but trembling. He felt the heat of her through the soaked cloth, the quick rise and fall of her ribs. He smelled sweat, fear, and the faint metallic tang of her wound. He turned them both downstream away from the shots, toward the deeper timber where the trail narrowed and the spirits watched closest. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Boots struck rock. A man shouted her name, sharp, angry, proprietary. Kael did not hurry. Hurry would leave tracks too plain blood, too fresh. He moved with the land silent, deliberate, carrying the weight of her and the heavier weight of what he had just done. The mountain kept its silence, but it no longer felt empty. The hide flap fell shut behind them with a soft slap of leather against stone. Inside the cave, the air was cooler, thick, with the scent of old pine smoke and dried sage. A single low fire burned in the center pit flames, no taller than a man's hand, casting long shadows across the rough walls. Kael set Thea down on a folded blanket near the warmth. She swayed once, then sank to her knees, breathing in shallow pulls. He did not speak. He moved to the far corner where a small bundle lay wrapped in deerskin. His fingers hesitated above it long enough that the fire popped once, sending a spark curling upward. Then he untied the thong and lifted out the dress. Soft buckskin beaded in simple lines of blue and white along the yoke. Naya's dress, the last thing she had worn before the traders took her south, before the fever took her in some California shack. Kael held it out without looking at Thea. She stared at the garment, then at him. Her hands were still shaking when she took it. He turned his back while she changed. The rustle of wet cloth dropping to the stone floor sounded loud in the quiet. He kept his eyes on the fire, watching the coals shift and settle. The memory came unbidden. Naya laughing at the riverbank, splashing water at him until he pretended to be angry. Then the empty camp the day he returned from the hunt. The tracks. The blood on the ground that wasn't hers yet. The long years of searching that ended with a grave marker no one had bothered to carve right. Thea finished. The buckskin hung loose on her thinner frame, but it fit well enough. She smoothed the beads with one palm, a small, uncertain gesture. Kael turned. His gaze went first to the dress, then to her face. Something tightened in his jaw, quick and gone. She opened her mouth perhaps to thank him, but closed it again when he raised a hand palm flat. No words. Not yet. He knelt across the fire from her and fed a thin stick into the coals. The flames licked higher for a moment, throwing light across the wall where old markings showed faint Deer Mountain handprints. Marks Tano had made when he was still strong enough to hold the ochre steady. A shadow moved at the entrance. Elder Tano stepped inside without sound. The old man's blanket was dark with age, his hair white and thin as winter grass. He stopped just inside the flap eyes, going first to the woman, then to the dress she wore, then to Kael. No greeting, no question. Tano's gaze lingered on the small smear of dried blood still visible on the buckskin's hem her blood carried here on her hands when she changed. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. He lifted one hand, fingers curled, and touched the air above the dress as though feeling for something unseen. "Spirits of your sister," he said at last, voice dry as cracked earth will not rest easy if this place holds the blood of strangers. The words hung between them. Kael did not answer. He only met the old man's eyes. Long seconds passed. The fire snapped once. Tano looked at Kael a moment longer, long enough that the silence grew heavy, pressing against the stone walls. Then he turned. No farewell. He stepped back through the flap and was gone, leaving only the faint smell of sage smoke on the air. Kael remained kneeling. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers curled but still. The cave felt smaller now. Thea watched him. She drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. The beads on the dress caught the firelight and flickered once. He rose slowly, crossed to the low shelf carved into the rock, and took down a small clay pot of water. He carried it to her without meeting her eyes and set it down beside her hand. "Drink," he said. One word. Quiet. She lifted the pot. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, brief, accidental. He did not pull away, but he did not stay close either. Outside, far down the slope, a horse snorted once. Distant. Still coming. Kael moved to the entrance. He stood just inside the flap, looking out into the dark timber. The night had thickened. Stars were sharp above the ridge. He listened. Behind him, Thea drank in small sips. The pot trembled slightly in her hands. He did not turn. He only stood there, back straight, hands loose at his sides, feeling the weight of the old man's silence settle deeper than any words could have carried. The fire burned lower, and somewhere in the dark, the first faint howl of a coyote rose thin, lonely, unanswered. The fire had burned down to a nest of red coals by the time the woman stirred. She had lain curled on the blanket for hours, breath-shallow body still fighting the chill that no blanket could chase away. Now she shifted a small sound, escaping her half-sigh, half-sob, and sat up slowly. The buckskin dress whispered against the stone floor. Kael sat cross-legged on the far side of the pit-back, straight hands resting loose on his knees. He had not moved since Elder Tano left. The cave smelled of smoke and damp rock, undercut by the faint, lingering metallic tang of her blood that still clung to the hem of Naya's dress. Thea rubbed her arms, shivering once. Her eyes found him in the dim glow. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Then her gaze dropped to the small shelf beside her. There, half hidden behind a folded hide, lay the smooth black stone no bigger than a man's palm. One side bore a single carved line, Naya's name in the old marks, the ones Tano had taught Kael to cut when they buried the last of her things. Thea's fingers brushed it before she realized what it was. A reflex seeking warmth or steadiness. The stone shifted under her touch, rolling slightly toward the firelight. The carved line caught the coal's red flicker and seemed to deepen. Kael's breath caught. Not loud. Just enough that the silence noticed. He rose without haste, crossed the small space in 3 steps, and knelt beside her. His hand hovered above the stone, close enough that she felt the warmth of his skin. But he did not touch it. Not yet. She drew her hand back as though burned. "I didn't mean," he did not answer. His eyes stayed on the stone, on the name. Memory rose unbidden. Naya's fingers guiding his own, and the first time he held the flint, laughing softly when he cut too deep. Slow, she had said. The name must last longer than we do. Then the empty years after. The trader's trail gone cold. The grave in California, dirt unmarked, except for the whisper of a name no one there could speak right. Now this woman, stranger outsider, had laid her hand on it. Kael lifted the stone carefully, as though it might crack under his fingers. He set it back on the shelf farther from her reach and turned to face her fully. His expression had not changed, but the lines around his mouth were deeper, carved by something heavier than fatigue. Thea watched him. She pulled the blanket tighter across her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her, then long, steady. Not angry, not forgiving. Just measuring. A shadow filled the entrance again. Elder Tano stepped inside once more. No sound of footsteps, only the faint brush of blanket against rock. The old man stopped 3 paces from the fire eyes, going straight to the stone on the shelf, then to Thea's hands, then to Kael. He said nothing. He only lifted one hand, slow, deliberate, and laid it flat above the carved name palm down, as though feeling for a heartbeat that wasn't there. The gesture lasted perhaps 10 seconds, long enough for the coals to shift once, sending a thin thread of smoke curling upward. Tano lowered his hand. His gaze met Kael's. In it was no accusation, no plea. Only the quiet weight of knowledge the spirits of the dead sister were restless now. Blood of a stranger had touched what should never be touched. Ghosts did not forgive easily. They took payment in slow ways, fever in the children corn that blackened before it ripened women who carried but never bore. The old man held Kael's eyes a moment longer. Then he turned. The flap lifted fell. He was gone. The cave felt colder. Kael remained kneeling. His hand stayed open on his thighs. He stared at the place where Tano had stood until the coals dimmed again. Thea drew her knees up tighter. She did not speak. After a long time, Kael rose. He crossed to the small cache near the back wall, took out a strip of dried meat wrapped in corn husk and a gourd of water drawn that morning from the spring. He set them beside her without a word. She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady now, though her hands still trembled when she reached for the gourd. He did not meet her gaze. He only returned to his place across the fire and sat again, back straight, hands loose. Outside, the night wind had begun to rise low at first, then stronger, carrying the faint, distant sound of horses moving slow through the timber below. Kael listened. The coals burned lower still. And in the silence between them, the carved stone on the shelf seemed to hold its own quiet heat, unseen, untouched, but no longer undisturbed. The dawn came gray and thin light, filtering down through the pines without warmth. Kael moved ahead of her on the narrow trail that skirted the hunting ground's moccasins, silent on the needle-strewn earth. Thea followed close steps, clumsy in the borrowed moccasins he had given her at first light. Her breathing was still ragged from the night's chill, but she kept pace. Neither spoke. They reached the rim of the agave flats, just as the sun cleared the ridge. Below the band's women moved among the plants, knives flashing as they cut the hearts, stacking them in baskets of woven yucca. Children darted between gathering fallen leaves for kindling. The smell of cut green and dry earth rose on the still air. Kael stopped behind a low juniper, motioning Thea down beside him. She crouched, knees aching against the rock. He watched the flats for a long minute. Then his gaze shifted left toward the spring that fed the lower ground. The water ran clear once now. A faint haze clouded it near the bank, silt stirred by something upstream. Not natural. Not yet. But enough to notice. Kael's jaw tightened once, small and quick. He had seen the tracks earlier, 3 sets of booted prints crossing the draw below, metal glints from a spur or a cartridge case dropped careless. Boone Slade's men. Colt, Vance Rye, Donovan Gage Holt. Names he had heard whispered in the trading posts. They were circling wider now, searching. Their passage had already brushed too close to the sacred water. A boy no more than 10 came up from the flats carrying a small basket. He paused at the spring's edge, dipped a gourd, drank. Then he coughed once, sharp, wet, and spat. The mother nearby looked up, frowned, and called him back. Kael felt the shift in his chest, not fear exactly, but the slow recognition of payment beginning. Ghosts did not strike fast. They lingered. A child's cough today, barren fields tomorrow, empty cradles the season after, He stayed motionless. Watched the boy return to the women. Watched the mother glance toward the spring again, then toward the timber where he and Thea hid. Her eyes narrowed. She said something low to the woman beside her. Heads turned. Not toward him exactly, but toward the direction of the haze in the water. Kael exhaled through his nose slow. The band had not seen him yet, but they felt the wrongness. The land was speaking, and they were listening. Thea shifted beside him. Her hand brushed his arm, light, hesitant. He did not pull away, but he did not look at her either. After a time, he rose careful, keeping the juniper between them and the flats. He led her back into thicker timber, away from the open ground. They stopped in a small hollow where the pines grew close. Kael knelt, drew his knife, and began scraping a rough map into the dirt lines for the ridge, a circle for the spring, a jagged scar for the mine workings downstream where Slade's men dug and poisoned. Copper Ridge, the place that sent its filth into the water long before the riders came looking. Thea watched him work. When he finished, she pointed to the scar. "That's where they're coming from," she said quietly. "The mine, the water, all of it." Kael looked up. His eyes held hers for the first time since the cave. No anger, no promise. Just the weight of what was already done. He erased the map with one slow sweep of his palm. Dust rose settled again. Then he stood. From the small pouch at his belt, he took a short length of cord and a flint flake. He tied the flake to the cord, tested the knot once. Preparation. Silent. Necessary. Thea rose too. She met his gaze. "I can watch," she said. "While you go closer?" Kael studied her. Long seconds passed. The wind moved high in the pines, a low sigh that carried no comfort. He gave one small nod. Not agreement. Acceptance. He turned toward the ridge that overlooked the mine. She fell in behind him. Behind them, down in the flats, the boy coughed again, sharper this time. The mother's voice rose, calling him nearer. The women paused in their work. Heads turned toward the spring. The haze in the water thickened just a shade. And somewhere upstream, faint but growing, came the distant clank of metal on metal machinery turning poison, seeping the land, remembering every step the strangers had taken. The moon hung low and thin, a sickle blade over the ridge. No wind stirred the tailings piles around Copper Ridge. Only the steady thump-thump of the pump engine carried across the dark metal heartbeat, keeping the lower shafts dry. Kael crouched behind a rusted ore cart 50 yards out. Thea beside him, her breath shallow and visible in the cold. The smell of coal smoke and wet iron hung heavy. Beneath it, the faint, sour rot of chemicals leaching into the ground. They had come down after full dark. Kael led without hurry, skirting the lit lanterns at the main shaft, using the shadows of spoil heaps. Thea matched his pace as best she could, boots wrapped in scraps of hide to muffle sound. Neither spoke. Words would have carried. The pump house stood separate, a squat timber building with a single lantern burning inside. Its door was ajar. Light spilled yellow across the dirt. Kael watched for 10 full minutes. No movement. The engine's rhythm never faltered. He rose. One gesture, palm flat stay. Thea nodded once. He crossed the open ground, low in silent shadow among shadows, until he reached the wall. He pressed his back to the rough boards, listened. Inside, the pistons hissed and clanked. Grease and oil thickened the air. Kael slipped through the door. The lantern swung gently on its hook, throwing long fingers of light across the machinery. He moved to the gear housing without pause. His knife came out short blade, dull gleam, and he worked the retaining pin free. The damaged gear he had carried in his pouch all day slid into place with a soft, metallic scrape. He tightened the pin again. Slow, deliberate, no sound louder than his own controlled breathing. The engine would seize sometime before dawn. Water would rise in the shafts. Men would scramble out alive. But the mine would choke for weeks. The poison flow downstream would slow. The spring might clear. He knew the cost the moment the pin clicked home. This was no quiet violation. No blood spilled in secret. This was hands on the land itself, outsider hands, even if guided by Apache will. The Gan would see. The ghosts would remember. No song, no offering, no night of fasting could wash this clean. Taboo broken in the open, irretrievable. Kael stepped back. The lantern light caught the sweat on his brow, the tight line of his mouth. He turned toward the door. A boot scuffed outside. Kael Ritter appeared in the frame lantern in one hand, rifle loose in the other. He froze, eyes widening at the figure inside. Who the hell Kael moved? Not fast, not wild. One step forward, hand snapping out. The rifle barrel came up. Kael caught it mid-swing, twisted hard. Metal clanged against metal. Ritter grunted, staggered. Kael drove an elbow into the man's gut, short, brutal, no flourish. Ritter folded breath, whooshing out. The lantern dropped shattered on the boards. Oil spread flames, licking up fast. Kael dragged him outside by the collar, dropped him in the dirt. Ritter wheezed, clutching his stomach. No time to finish it. Kael turned and ran low toward the ore cart. Thea was already moving. She met him halfway, eyes wide but steady. They slipped into the darkness together, boots kicking dust hearts, hammering in the sudden quiet after the crash. Behind them, shouts rose, men spilling from the bunkhouse, lanterns swinging. Fire pump house. They reached the timberline. Kael stopped, turned once. High on the ridge, a single figure stood motionless against the moonlit sky blanket, dark hair white. Elder Tano, not moving closer, not calling out, only watching. The old man's silhouette held for a long breath. Then he turned slow and walked away into the night. Kael felt it settle in his chest like cold stone the band would know by morning. Not what he had done exactly, but that something had been done. That the land had been touched in a way that could not be untouched. That he had chosen. He looked at Thea. Her face was pale, streaked with soot and sweat. She met his eyes without flinching. He gave no nod, no word. He only turned up slope, leading her deeper into the pines. Behind them, the pump house burned low, and sullen smoke rising black against the stars. The engine's thump slowed, coughed, then stopped altogether. And on the ridge, the place where Elder Tano had stood, was empty now. But the silence that followed felt heavier than before, final, unyielding, the kind that comes when a door closes and cannot be opened again. The climb back to the sacred cave took the rest of the night. They moved slow, picking careful footing among loose shale and pine roots, the moon long gone, and only starlight to guide them. Thea's steps had steadied, but her breathing still came short when the grade steepened. Kael did not offer a hand. He walked ahead, rifle slung across his back eyes, sweeping the dark for any sign the riders had followed. Inside the cave, the air was stale heavy with the ghosts of old fires. The small pit still held a trace of ash from the night before. Kael knelt at once beside the low shelf where the ancestral stones rested, flat slabs of black basalt names, cut deep by hands long dead. Tano had shown him each one when he was a boy. The first mark for the one who walked out of the mountains, the next for the woman who carried fire through the long winter. Kael's own hand had added the line for the grandfather who taught the quiet ways. Now one slab lay cracked. A hairline fracture ran through the center name, splitting the old marks like a wound that would never close. The break was fresh edges, sharp dust still pale along the seam. Perhaps the distant rumble of the mine workings had shaken the stone. Perhaps the Gan themselves had pressed down in anger. Either way, it was done. Kael touched the fracture with one fingertip. The stone was cold. He traced the split, slowly feeling the rough edge catch his skin. No blood came, only the quiet sting of knowing. Behind him, Thea stood near the entrance blanket pulled tight. She did not speak. She only watched. He remained kneeling a long time. Memory came without invitation, Tano's voice low in the firelight years ago, guiding his small hand with the flint. The name must stay whole, the old man had said. If it breaks, the one who carried it walks restless. Kael had nodded, then believing the words absolute. Now the crack stared back at him, proof that nothing stayed whole forever, not stone, not promise, not the land itself. A shadow filled the low doorway. Elder Tano stepped inside. No sound of approach, only the faint shift of blanket cloth. The old man stopped 3 paces away, eyes going straight to the broken stone. He knelt slowly, joints creaking like dry wood, and laid one palm flat over the fracture. His fingers spread, covering the name, as though to hold it together. For a long breath he stayed that way. Then he lifted his head and looked at Kael. No words, only the steady gaze, old, unblinking, carrying the weight of everything seen and not spoken. The spirits had noted the violation. The ghosts of the ancestors would not rest easy while the land bled downstream. The crack in the stone was their mark payment begun, more to come. Tano rose. He turned without haste and walked out into the gray before dawn. The flap fell shut behind him. Kael stayed on his knees. His hand remained on the stone. The fracture felt wider under his touch now, though it had not moved. Thea moved closer. She knelt beside him, close enough that he felt the warmth of her shoulder, the faint scent of pine needles caught in her hair. She did not touch the stone. She only looked at it, then at him. He reached into the small pouch at his belt, drew out the flint flake he carried always. He fitted it to the crack's edge and struck once, small, controlled. A fresh mark appeared beside the break, one short line angled sharp. Not a name, a promise. To guard what remained, even if the guarding cost everything. The new cut threw tiny sparks into the dim. They died before touching the floor. Kael set the flake aside. He looked at Thea. Her eyes were steady gray in the faint light. Outside, the first thin wind of morning moved through the pines, carrying the distant, unmistakable sound of voices from the flats below. Not angry yet. Not searching. Simply talking. The band had gathered. They had seen the haze in the spring thicken overnight. They had heard the boy's cough turn to fever. They were deciding what must be done. Kael rose. He offered Thea his hand, not to pull her up, but to steady her if she chose to stand. She took it. The cave held its silence. But the new mark on the stone gleamed wet and fresh, and the fracture beside it seemed to deepen in the growing light. The streets of Prescott lay quiet under the late afternoon sun dust, hanging gold in the slanted light. Kael kept to the edge of town, back against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine on the low ridge overlooking the main drag. From here, he could see the stone building that served as Marshal Kane's office, solid, squat, its windows dark against the whitewashed walls. Thea had gone in alone an hour earlier. Her figure had disappeared through the door without a backward glance. He had not followed. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and a horse sweat from the livery below. Kael stood motionless, blanket drawn close against the chill that had begun to settle in his bones. His rifle rested across his forearms, barrel pointed down. He watched. The door opened again. Thea stepped out, flanked by a deputy. She moved stiffly, shoulders squared, but her steps were measured careful, as though the ground itself might give way. They walked her 2 blocks to Widow Rose's boarding house. Kael tracked them from shadow to shadow, never close enough to be seen, never far enough to lose sight. Inside the boarding house, the windows glowed yellow as lamps were lit. Kael moved down slope, found a narrow alley behind the livery, and settled against the wall, where the scent of hay and manure masked his own. From here he could see the parlor window. Thea sat at a small table near it, back straight, hands folded. She spoke to Widow Rose. The widow nodded once slow, then the street filled with the sound of boots and low voices. Boone's Slade rode in with 4 men. Dust rose around the horses' hooves. He dismounted, heavy boots striking the boards like hammer blows. His coat was dark wool, expensive but stained now with trail grime. He pushed through the boarding house door without knocking. Kael felt the shift in his chest, tight, cold. He knew what came next. He had seen men like Slade before, words first threats wrapped in silk, then the hand on the gun, if silk failed. Through the window, he watched Slade loom over Thea's table. The man's mouth moved, slow, deliberate. Thea did not rise. She looked up at him, face pale but steady. Slade leaned closer. His hand rested on the back of her chair, possessive, not gentle. Widow Rose stood in the doorway, arms crossed but said nothing. Kael's fingers tightened on the rifle stock. Wood creaked under his grip. He could end it now. 1 shot from this distance. Clean. Final. But the bullet would carry blood, his blood, her blood. The blood that had already stained the spring and cracked the ancestral stone. 1 more drop, and the last quiet rite. The one that asked forgiveness without demanding it would be gone forever. No song left to sing. No offering the gone would hear. He stayed still. Slade spoke longer. Thea answered once short, low. The man straightened. His face darkened. He turned and strode out, coat flapping. The door slammed behind him. His men followed. Horses stamped, then moved off down the street toward the Grand Hotel. Kael exhaled once slow. The breath tasted of pine resin and dust. Night fell hard. Lamps dimmed one by one. Kael waited until the deputy at the boarding house door slumped in his chair, head nodding. Then he crossed the alley, scaled the back wall, silent as shadow, and eased along the narrow ledge outside the second-floor window. Thea sat at the small table inside, lamp low, staring at nothing. She looked up when the sash lifted, slow, careful. Her eyes widened, but she made no sound. Kael slipped inside. He closed the window behind him without a click. The room smelled of lamp oil and lye soap. He stood 3 paces away, hands loose at his sides. She rose, crossed to him, stopped close enough that he felt the warmth of her, the faint tremor in her breathing. He lifted 1 hand slow and touched her forehead with 2 fingers. Not a caress, a mark. Brief. The skin was warm under his calloused tips. "My heritage," he said, voice so low it barely carried, "is in your hands now." She did not flinch. She only looked at him long, steady. Then she nodded once. Outside, far across the dark ridge, a single figure stood against the starlight blanket, dark hair white. Elder Tano, watching, not moving closer, not leaving. Kael stepped back to the window. He eased it open again. The old man remained motionless on the ridge. Kael slipped out, dropped to the alley below, and melted into the shadows. The night held its breath. But the touch lingered on Thea's forehead, like a brand unseen, unspoken, and already carrying the weight of what could not be taken back. The sun bled low across the valley, painting the Prescott rooftops in dull copper and long shadows. Thea walked the edge of town alone. boots scuffing dry grass, the deputy's orders behind her, now lifted like a weight no longer felt. The boarding house stood quiet behind her. Widow Rose had pressed a small bundle of cornbread into her hands without a word. Boone Slade was gone, taken in irons at first light, Elias Ford's papers heavy enough to bend even his lawyers. The mine would stand idle for months. The spring might heal in time. She climbed the low ridge without hurry. The flat stone waited where she remembered it, broad sun-warmed overlooking the sprawl below. Kael sat there already back to the town knees, drawn up the cracked ancestral stone resting in his open palm. He had carried it from the cave. The fracture caught the dying light and threw a thin black line across his fingers. Thea stopped 3 paces away. The wind moved through the bunch grass, carrying dust and the faint smell of pine resin. She lowered herself to the stone beside him, not touching, not close. They sat in silence while the valley darkened. Kael turned the stone once in his hand. The name his grandfathers cut deep generations ago remained legible, but the split ran through it like a scar that would never fade. He traced the crack with one fingertip. No sound, no sigh. Only the slow acceptance that what had been whole was broken now, and no right could mend it. The Gon had seen the pump house burn, the water fouled the land touched in ways no offering could erase. The band had sent word through a boy at dawn, and the spring ran thinner still. The deer had moved higher. The coughs in the winter lodges had deepened. They survived, but not unchanged. Elder Tano stood far down the slope, dark blanket against the twilight grass, white hair catching the last red glow. He did not approach. He only watched, arms, folded face unreadable. The witness who carried what had happened into whatever came next. Kael set the stone between them on the flat rock. It rested there, heavy, silent. Thea looked at it, then at him. Her voice came low, steady. I'm free now. The papers say the mine stops. Slade's gone. I could go back to San Francisco. Sell what's left. Live quiet. Kael did not answer at once. He stared out over the valley where lamps were beginning to flicker in the windows below. The town looked small from here, fragile, built on borrowed ground. After a long time he spoke. The land remembers what we did. The ghosts do not forgive quick. The band will not take me back as I was. The spring will run clear someday, but not for me. Thea reached out. Her fingers brushed the stone light, careful. She did not lift it. I won't go back, she said. Not alone. Not to that. Kael turned his head. Their eyes met in the fading light. No promise passed between them. No vow spoken. Only the quiet knowledge that whatever path lay ahead would carry the crack with it, permanent, unhealed. He lifted the stone once more, held it out to her, palm open. Take it, he said. So the memory does not die. Thea closed her fingers around it. The basalt was still warm from his hand. She felt the fracture under her thumb, sharp, unyielding. They sat on. The valley darkened fully. Stars came out cold and sharp overhead. Elder Tano remained on the slope below, watching, always watching. Then, slow as the turning of seasons, he turned and walked away into the dark timber. His blanket blended with the night until only the white of his hair showed for a moment longer. Then nothing. Kael and Thea stayed where they were. The wind rose again, low, steady, carrying the faint, bitter smell of distant smoke from the ruined pump house. The stone rested between them now in her hand, in his memory, and neither moved to break the silence. But the fracture in it caught starlight and held it a thin, bright line against the dark, reminding them both victory had come. And so had the price. Dawn broke thin and pale over the ridge light, spilling slow across the valley like spilled milk. The flat stone still held the night's chill underfoot. Kael stood at its edge, blanket draped loose across his shoulders, the cracked ancestral stone resting in his open palm. Thea stood beside him, close enough that their sleeves brushed once, when the wind shifted far enough that neither needed to step away. No words passed between them. The mended wound on her arm had scabbed over. The borrowed buckskin dress hung softer, now worn by days and nights. In her other hand, she held the scrap of fabric torn from Naya's hem, faded blue beads still clinging to the thread, a small, stubborn piece of what had been taken and could not be given back whole. Kael turned the stone once. The fracture caught the first true light and split it into thin, bright shards across his fingers. He traced the break with one calloused thumb, slow, deliberate, feeling the rough edge catch skin without drawing blood. The name of his grandfather remained, but the line through it was permanent. No fire, no chant, no night spent fasting on bare rock would seal it again. The taboo had been broken in the open. The gun had seen. Ghosts did not bargain. Down in the valley, the town stirred smoke rising from chimneys, horses stamping in the livery voices, faint and distant. Boone's Slade was gone. The mine stood silent. The spring might run clear again in years, not seasons. But the band had moved their winter camp higher, farther from the fouled water and the memory of what had been done. They lived. They did not forget. Elder Tano stood on the opposite hill, dark against the pale sky. He had not come closer since the night before. Now he simply watched, arms folded, blanket, still white hair lifting once in the breeze. The witness who carried every step, every touch, every crack into whatever followed. Kael lifted his gaze to the old man. Long seconds held. Tano did not nod. He did not turn away at once. Then, slow as stone weathering, he shifted, turned, and walked down slope into the timber. His figure grew smaller until the pines swallowed him. No farewell. No promise of return. The wind rose light, carrying dust from the sacred ground, fine grit that stung the eyes and settled on the tongue like ash. No birds called. The valley below stayed quiet, except for the low murmur of waking life that belonged to others now. Kael lowered his hand. He offered the stone to Thea, palm open, fingers steady. She took it without hesitation. The basalt was cool against her skin, heavier than it looked. The fracture pressed into her palm like a line drawn in bone. She closed her fingers around it. They stood on. The sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened. The town below grew louder, wheels creaking, voices calling, metal striking metal in the distance. Kael looked once more toward the empty hill where Tano had been. Then he looked at Thea. She met his eyes. No question in them. No answer needed. He reached out slow and touched the scrap of Naya's dress in her other hand. His fingers brushed the beads once light as breath. Then he let his hand fall. Neither moved. The wind carried more dust across the stone, fine, relentless, settling into every crack. The valley waited, and in the silence between them, the fractured stone rested, held now in her hand, carried in his memory, and neither spoke to break it. The ghosts watched. They always would. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. I thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development. The emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.